I'm Brett Cooper, and this is the Frontline Mobility Edge, where we discuss the latest in mobile device technologies and how they're shaping the frontline landscape business. Thank you for joining us. Let's get started. Today, I'm joined by Alan Lampa, CTO of BlueFletch, and Richard Makerson, CEO of BlueFletch. And we're going to talk about a topic that we've been doing. I think this is probably year 10 of this topic from our first project we did around this, which is iOS to Android migration. So we've had a former podcast where we talked about Windows CE and legacy app to Android migrations. And this one, we want to talk about migrating from iOS to Android. A lot of companies in the last 10 years we worked with have leveraged our teams to help with this, mainly around, hey, we need to bring in some experts in Android that also have some iOS experience, how to do it. So we have a couple topics to hop into. And I guess as we get into it, the first one we wanted to cover was, in general, just why do companies decide to migrate from iOS to Android? And Richard, I know you've talked people down from the ledge a couple times on this one. What are your key takeaways or guidance for companies as you talk to them about why you need to consider I'm going to call it a professional grade piece of hardware?
I mean, just flip the question on me. So why do I see companies migrate from iOS to Android? Two reasons are usually like really, really at the top. The reality that iOS isn't a true rugged device, even though you can throw a sled or a bumper on it. Those economics over time become real, but then also the clunky experience. So if I have iOS devices out of my fleet, everything seems great. I'm, the greatest CIO ever. But when I have those high failure rates because iOS isn't meant to be shared, it's not meant to be used, 20, 24 hours a day, and it starts to impact my business, starts to impact uh, the the happiness of workers, meaning that they're frustrated, annoyed, um, that devices don't last a full shift, or now I need to carry this extra battery with me, or it's broken. Now I need to send it off and do another one and go back to paper. That business impact um, oftentimes outweighs, you know, the cost difference between an iOS and Android device. Um, and then the clunky experience. Now, if your end users are primarily in a single application, like a very big EMR or CMS, um, like that, like isn't a big problem. But especially early on, um, you know, our customers or folks just wanted to get the devices out there, like just get them out there. Generally, everyone knows how to use an iOS device. If they don't, it's really easy to figure out. Johnny Ive's designed amazing hardware, but then you start adding and layering in more solutions over time. And with iOS, you really don't have control over that experience. You have to work with what Apple's given you. And so that clunky experience, once again, I think the key here is that it hits the bottom line or the impact to the business harder than some of those decisions you would have made early on by going with a true rugged or frontline platform.
On your note on the experience, and aside from, I heard the rumors that Johnny Ive helped design the terrible Ferrari. Is that true?
It's an interesting Ferrari. It's not like a Ferrari, but I think some of the design decisions, especially in the interior, are very interesting. And um, when they announced that vehicle, they showed the inside first. So like tactile feel, the steering wheel, um, even the screen and like some of the controls and how uh, they led with that first, which is probably leading with what uh, they knew folks were going to get excited about. But then when everyone saw like the whole vehicle together, they were like, "No, we didn't ask for this, and we don't want this."
I feel like, yeah, I've heard you say something similar to this around the hardware landscape. What's the old Henry Ford quote? You can have any Ford you want in any color as long as it's black. And I feel like the thing about that's sort of how I feel about Apples. You're going to get what they give you, whereas with the Android landscape, you have a lot of different OEMs, which I'm assuming have like different features, capabilities, designs. For you, when you think about having different OEMs available to support your enterprise project, what are the biggest takeaways you have from that, or the biggest value adds you see there?
Yeah, we get into one of my later points, but I think there is value and there's value to be found in having options. And I think that when you have, um, Apple only makes iOS, they only make their own hardware. Their biggest customers are consumers, not frontline employees. Initially, it could seem like you have a lot of options. And when you realize that you're, a fraction of their user base and um, you're not really going to be able to impact change, um, it's hard to extract a true value out of that. But having multiple vendors who make, rugged Android devices, and to know that you may be able to offer up some change or impact the decision with a particular OEM, like that's valuable. If I'm a name a big company in manufacturing or logistics or airlines, and it'd be great if I had this, and your OEM is like, yeah, we'll do that for you. Um, there's a lot of value in that value you'll extract out for your business, but value in that relationship. And so it's there and it's there to be found. And so for, someone like myself and a company like us of problem solvers, we're always hunting for that value to, make our customers happy, make that end user experience the best it can be.
Another question on your notes. When you and I talked about this before, I think there was the life cycle in the enterprise versus a life cycle consumer devices. I feel like you and I are probably pretty bad. Our wives get angry at us about going and buying a new iPhone every year. The typical uh, lifespan for a device in enterprise could be 5+ years. I feel like I've seen some warehouses that are running 7-year-old devices. How does
Easy.
that impact the value of iOS versus some of these OEMs?
Yeah, it's a moving target. And so it impacts, you know, that infrastructure manager VP's experience of having to manage these devices, because I know every year I'm going to get an iOS update that I have some control over it. I can defer it for X amount of months, but I know it's going to change. And depending on where we're at in the life cycle, it could change the look and feel. They might retire or bring in new features that I need to be ready for. Um, because it's designed for consumers, right? For everyone from 6 year olds to us to our parents. Um, it's trying to meet all of those needs all at the same time versus having a dedicated platform that's focused on business outcomes, where I want to deploy this and not make any changes unless um, we actually need to roll out this feature. But there's value in knowing that I don't have to constantly look over my shoulder for this change that's coming that I have no control over. So to have total control over your OS major version, knowing that I roll this out and everything is working, I can focus on other fire drills or other parts of the business or go deeper into other experiences. It's just a lot of comfort and confidence that comes from knowing that you have that foundation to work from, that you just don't have any control with iOS. Like we've talked about it before, working with a big airline here. Um, I don't want to say we almost got fired from our project, but they thought we were trying to just, you know, create another statement of work because we wanted more money. We had a developer at WWDC. They got out of a session, realized that a change was coming that was going to negatively impact this project that we were working on. A customer didn't believe us, and it took about a month of being pretty ridiculously annoying before we got them and Apple on the phone, and they ultimately said, "Yeah, we're right, and don't care how big you are, you're not bigger than you know every consumer across the world, this change is coming.
Yeah, I
So
imagine if a company with 30,000 Android devices went to Zebra or Honeywell and said we need to keep this API, that those two companies are not going to remove them just because they feel like it.
yeah, this
So
company had 80,000 employees and they were banging on their chest, and
yeah, I
Apple's like,
remember
we got
somebody at
2
one point in
billion
time. Somebody at one point in time was like the entire rugged market is what Apple sells every month to consumers. So they don't care about AIDC, or they don't care about the enterprise market. So
much as we do, correct.
yeah, it's definitely a thing. I think the other thing too, and you had noted this when we had chatted about it before, just the shared device experience and what you can do with companies like BlueFletch a uh, on a Android device versus iOS device, just some of those capabilities. Can you maybe dive into that a little bit? Just thinking about the difference between the two platforms.
Yeah, so, like, the difference, especially when you're thinking about, migrating, in this iOS world, what does it look like in this Android world? Um, Shamelessly, my perception is a bit different. I think we have the best shared device platform in the world. And I think if you're starting or thinking about how do you move, it's not how do I lift this iOS experience and pluck it down in Android. You should really throw away all your perceived notions and just focus on what's the experience you want to have. Start there. Like, what's your wish list? What's top? If I could do this, if we could do this, if this was better, folks would be happy, or we'd have a much more seamless experience, or we'd have so much more visibility into business operations. Um, Start there, because from there, you're always able to walk it back. And so I know early in our career um, at BlueFletch, and it still happens today, folks are still, they still put themselves in a box when they don't have to. And, I think it's easier for them to come out the box when you start to talk about just next steps, like what what's the what's the best place to start. And for us, we don't want to sit here and migrate everything from iOS in one shot. Like, just pick one thing to solve, whether it's the hardest thing, the easiest thing, and then build from there. Because then you're able to start to build those small wins and get the buy-in and get people to believe that, yeah, we can start thinking outside the box and really just think about the problem at hand and not be constrained with um, how we were constrained previously with iOS.
Can you maybe, like, so that was a second topic or question I had for you. So imagine, just let's be specific. Imagine you're a retailer with 1,000 stores and 10,000 iOS devices currently deployed in the field. How would you recommend they go through that process? You mentioned starting with the experience. Think about what is your ideal state. How should they go and think about going from where they are to actually a professional grade Android environment? Like, what are the steps involved in that?
Yeah, I mean, taking inventory uh, of those 1,000 stores, those devices. Like, what are the applications? What are the use cases? Do you have problem stores? Like, do you have stores in areas that, um, for whatever reason, seem to have problems, whether it's network, store location, store makeup? Do you have pilot stores? And I think from there, you rank and stack your list of priorities and come up with a set of pilot stores or locations or users that kind of touch your best users every day. And then, like, what's a problem set of either user stores or locations, and solve a particular problem. Like, maybe it's device accountability, maybe it's single sign on an application that you just need to prove that it's happening. Maybe it's a certain experience, right? Maybe you're actually wanting to introduce um, AI for whatever reason to either level up or accelerate the maturing of store associates and get that buy-in. Yeah, usually it starts with just inventorying everything that's out there, identifying the use cases, identifying your best locations average worse, um, and then let's prioritize. And how can we get this new technology in a location in a store associate's hands as quick as possible so that we can get feedback. I
How,
think the
how
worst
do you,
thing you could,
yeah, how do you recommend? So you get this experience, you get sort of a lay of the land. How do you think about going and actually picking hardware next? So there are, on the Android side, there's a dozen manufacturers you can buy for handhelds and tablets. Like, how do you actually think about, you have your use case design. How do you figure out what your actual physical hardware looks like you're going to go purchase and what you put out in the stores or warehouses or in or hospitals?
yep. Well, if you got the time, the fun thing about it is you have multiple OEMs, Zebras and Honeywells, Datalogic, SpectraLink, um, you name it, like you have a lot to choose from. So it depends on the use cases. Do I need just mobile computers? Do I need mobile computers and tablets? Do we have kiosks, price checkers? Am I approaching end of life with some of my point of sale uh, units? Because now you're having these Android devices that are dockable. You have some headless Android devices that could run as desktops as well. And so it's really just understanding those use cases and like coming up with a priority. But I think the fun part of it is you have options. And so now you have uh, some value that comes from those options. Some, OEMs bring different value or different like core value that they have depending on um, the device that you want. But then you can also extract, or you have the opportunity to extract some of that value that you just don't have with iOS because you have these OEMs that care about rugged shared devices and frontline workers, and that's what they're dedicated to. And so, um, I think that's how you go after it.
You talked about like testing these. I'm assuming, there's proof of concept where you test these different pieces of hardware.
Mhm.
Yeah, you mentioned before having one or two applications you go after. How do you decide to go from there? Like, what's the exit criteria from proof of concept? Hey, we like these, this tablet and this handheld. Now it's time to go, write some big checks and start piloting in stores and proving out. How do you go from your POC to the next steps?
It's a tough one because sometimes it comes down to just relationship and who you're comfortable with. 'Cause having the device is one thing, um, but what else comes with it? So I have my um, device, but it, will it will it meet my needs? To your point, 4 to 6 years from now, meaning this device is priced well, it looks well, but doesn't have a tensor chip. So when we're ready to roll in AI, am I going to negatively impact the experience on all these devices um, going forward? What does the support cycle look like? Although they are rugged, devices still break for a slew of reasons. What is that repair and maintenance uh, process? Will I have a hard time getting devices a few years out? I think a lot of the OEMs have done a real good job of working with Google on supporting versions of Android. So that's less of a huge factor or consideration. Do I need to have a strong hot swappable battery um, device or option? And then, how comfortable am I with, the leadership of the company? Because, who knows what technology or the end user experience or the consumer experience for this retailer um, uh, delivering for the customers is going to expect in a few years. Do I trust this OEM to continue to innovate and have the tools, but also take my suggestions and be here to support us 4 to 6 years from now? And so there's a lot of just facets of that decision making process that I can only offer up support and talk about our experience and the experience we've seen in this industry. But yeah, it's a decision that leadership with that retailer or the customer is going to have to make.
So once you've decided on hardware, you've gotten through POC and you're like, this is what we want. And now we need to get it to all 1,000 stores. What is the next step? Do you just like ship 10,000 devices out and swap them overnight? Or how do you typically recommend people do that?
No, it's having a really good process and having a really good partner. Having a good partner that can stage, kit, and ship, but also work with a company like BlueFletch and um, with our tooling to make it as seamless as possible. So if the device is shipped to a location or store, that it's as easy as opening a box and turning the device on, and that device is ready to be used. You want to minimize or even eliminate any touches an end user needs as far as getting a device up and going. And so that's a project in itself and takes some time. I think our tooling and some of the tooling of the EMMs, especially when you think about Android Enterprise Zero Touch, makes some of uh, these unboxing experiences a bit better. But even in that, it's not just ship a device out and a store associate's going to load all the software. That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Although
Just go
the
install, click on all these things, install the software, see what happens. Yeah.
yes, in these 20 barcodes and
Oh my goodness.
approach.
I've seen that before, that you definitely leverage a value added reseller to help preload everything for you. Before we hop in, I have a bunch of technical questions for Alan. Before I hop into that, when you think about that scenario of 1,000 plus stores and 10,000 devices, how long realistically does that take from starting your evaluation, going and migrating your initial sets of apps, yeah, migrating all of your apps, proof of concepting, and then piloting? Like, what would you say a expected life cycle for that would be? Is it 2 weeks, 5 weeks, 5 years?
I think it'll depend on there's there's the there's the skill aspect, right? So if you have a pure iOS team and need to rescale, retool, you're looking at months to get something out the door, and to Rick's point, right? Target, you know, pick one, get it through the process. Um, Focus on that, understand what your team's limitations are, um, and adjust accordingly. I think that's where that would sit. Um, at least from a migration standpoint, I think we've seen. I don't know if you remember, um, like when we did, um, we had a customer that did. They initially had the iOS phones on sleds, and we switched them over to Android. Um, uh, uh, Took a couple of months at least,
I
I
think
think.
4 to 6 months to get to pilot is what I've typically seen. And then I feel like a full project is typically about a year to get everything replaced, and not big bang roll them out like I was trolling Richard on above. Um, Alan, on the technical pieces, I mean, there's a bunch of different areas, technical differences between iOS and Android. When you think about the buckets, I think we talked about like architecture, skill set, tooling, uh, deployment. Can you talk about those? Maybe when you think about architectural differences between iOS and iOS apps versus Android, what are the big, I guess, learnings you would have people go start to pick up in that first 4 to 6 months?
I guess taking a step back in general, like from Android to iOS, right? You get a lot more flexibility, but you also do get a little bit more complexity, right? But you do have more control over, to Rick's point earlier, what do you actually want to happen versus on iOS of what can I do in a box, right? So from an architecture standpoint, there's at least the biggest pain points that or the biggest friction that I've seen is just understanding, Android has different life cycles. Like there's an actual component where your processor running, and Android can kill it at any time, depending on what's running on your device. So being able to handle, when the screen, even the point where your screen rotates, or your app goes to the background, or you can actually run background applications now on Android. So those are the things that people or developers going from iOS to Android need to brush up on or get skilled on, just how that whole works. Uh, and then you also have to think about, there's the UI framework differences, obviously, and language differences. You're moving from Swift to Kotlin. Your UI is moving to Compose. There's some similarities there with Swift UI. So it's not a hard transition, at least internally. Even for us, we've had pretty good success with our iOS developers being able to go between iOS and Android fairly quickly. The other thing that would change for, I think, for iOS developers, from an architect standpoint, you have to think about, you're dealing with multiple OSs, right? You're dealing with multiple OSs, you're dealing with multiple devices. The OEMs control what is available from an OS standpoint. So as an app developer, you have to understand that, my app has to be able to run on these devices, and I have to be able to support OSs further back.
I guess the example there would be like, we've seen some retailers that are running from Android 9 all the way up to Android 15 at the same time. So your development team has to be able to understand the different, I guess, different API surfaces that Google's publishing for those.
Right. And this is where I would go with, at least having using native Android. Google does a pretty good job of transitioning between OS versions, and that backward compatibility. One of the things from a skill standpoint, you talked about, or I think you were starting to mention around the SDK start, from an enterprise standpoint, your scope is bigger than just consumer devices. You have your OEMs like Zebra, Honeywell. They have SDKs that you can tie into. So understanding those pieces as well can help your use cases get better, or you'll be able to define more of what you want with those versus just having to rely on sleds. What else?
Maybe you can dive into like the skill set. Richard talked about this, but having iOS developer, or you talked about it, having iOS developers that do iOS and Android. What are the big differences from a skill set standpoint that they have to think about or know about between the two platforms?
Well, there's the language portion, Swift to Kotlin, UI to Compose. I talked about earlier just the lifecycle piece, just understanding that. There's things that you can do on Android that you cannot necessarily do on iOS. Background's pretty hard on, or maybe not even possible on iOS. We have the advantage that, like, our software runs on Android, our launcher runs on Android, and there are some things that you can put on that, whereas you can't really customize that on iOS. And the one I haven't talked about is, the build is a little bit different, right? So we've got Gradle that you'll still need to learn on Android as well. What did I miss, Rick?
I guess tooling. Like when you think about tooling, I know if you're doing iOS, you need an iPhone, you need or an iPad, and you need a Mac laptop. Like that to me feels like the biggest difference. With Android, you can have a Linux machine, Windows machine. I guess what are the other big things for like an environment setup or development setup between iOS and Android?
Yeah, I
You need the
think.
right developers. Sorry to cut you off, Alan.
No, you're good.
Not as much of a thing today, but like 8 years ago, folks would just say, like, I'm an iOS developer. Like they're allergic to developing on Android, like a nut allergy or something. Like they were just not tolerant to wanting to do anything else like but this one thing because they were, um, decent at it. And so I think it really comes down to the developer too, being like, okay, just knowing that this is just another language. I'll figure it out, and then I'll have another, notch in my tool belt.
I mean, in fairness though, Apple did figure out, the developer tooling experience. They figured that out like much earlier than Android did. Um, but
True, but who's always had the best IDE though?
Yeah, I feel like Android Studio has gotten really good.
way better over the years.
Yeah, in the last couple of years. And I guess from a deployment standpoint, you mentioned like building APKs, Alan, on the Android side, like that process and getting them on devices and deployed out to devices like POC devices. So what's the big difference there is when you think about, from the standpoint of building on a machine versus getting it in a pipeline, getting it out the door?
Right. So, I mean, there's the tooling in on the iOS side, right? You still have um, it's pretty well defined. There's not a lot of options. You've got Apple Business Manager. Um, if you're on your developer or if you're doing development, getting through QA, you've got test flight and so on. Um, there's a lot more options on the Android side, as far as you can still sideload internally. You've got choices from an MDM standpoint as well. You're not just locked down to Apple Business Manager or the Play Store. Um, so internal apps, there's you have the enterprise provisioning for iOS, but you do have a lot more options um, on the Android side. Uh, the the things that you just need to consider, um, at least going into production on the production side, right? You have the OS update and patch. Like iOS controls your OS updates basically, um, but especially on Android, at least you still have your OEMs. Um, they're releasing that for you, and you have more control over when you actually upgrade. Like to what you mentioned earlier, we have customers that are still moving from going through that process, moving from 9 and to 15. Um, so that's really just where those differences are. Um,
Richard, I have a question for you. I know you're pretty steeped in Android Enterprise. Can you talk about Android Enterprise, what it is, and just things for if a company is moving from iOS and managing through the standard iOS processes versus going to Android Enterprise? What are the big value adds that Google has built around that ecosystem?
So I think there's two pieces of Android Enterprise that oftentimes don't get talked about unless you're a Google engineer talking to a customer. Um, about 6 or 7 years ago, Android democratized managing Android devices. So they created Android Enterprise, which gave you a standard set of APIs that you could register for to manage Android devices, and Google would be the device policy controller. So implementing those low-level Android settings, APIs, changes, app installs um, on devices. But along with that, Android really um, upped its game around just security, because one of the notions, um, especially in 2016, 2017, was that Android is open source. It's not as secure. So all the scanning and play protect that goes into looking at the APKs that are not only in the Play Store, but on your device that you've installed or side loaded, to the things you can't do, to even, although it's annoying, some of the um, wall garden that they've created around applications has made like Android really, really safe and secure as a platform. But this was Google or Android's answer to, okay, we're just as secure as any other mobility platform, um, but also too we're open to how this is managed, and creating guardrails around that um, EMMs and customers or whoever wants to manage an Android device should and ought to follow.
Got it. Last topic. I know we got a couple minutes here left. I'm going to call it the misses or the gotchas. So when we work with companies or talk to companies that are going through this process, are there things that a lot of them will overlook or miss? And so I guess maybe we'll start, Richard, with you on the business and operational side. You mentioned the litany of things above, but like what are the 4 or 5 you see people sort of skip over that they should be investing more time and effort into?
I think I talked early on about some folks in leadership make this like a personal decision. They're like, a 6-year-old can use it, I can use it, my parents can use it. So why can't my delivery drivers or my clinicians or my warehouse workers use it? Well, there are companies that build devices specifically for them and they ought to be using those devices. Um, I think carrier subsidies oftentimes hide the long-term pain of iOS not being a shareable device. And so then you run into the business impact wall pretty hard. And usually the way you get out of it is to just throw more devices at it, like it's Halloween candy. And, coming to the realization that Apple is always going to do what's in the best interest for Apple and its customer, which are consumers, not frontline workers. I think you gave the stat that the whole rugged market space is what Apple does like every month for consumers. And so I think when folks really internalize that, they realize that no matter how big am I as a company, I'm not going to be able to change Apple's mind because like I'm a fraction of what's possible, and I need to partner up with a really good value-added reseller, but then also understand which OEM fits my company, our use cases, and has the right device mix and investment that that makes sense for me to invest over time. And I think those are the two biggest ones um, that probably hit the hardest, and they hit so hard that they usually don't go. They're not spoken about publicly too much.
The quiet secrets that are out there. And Alan, for you on the technical side, are there things that you feel like as companies are evaluating iOS versus Android that they miss, or when they're doing the migration, like things that they miss or just got you see in these migration type projects?
Um, from a migration standpoint, there's the just understanding your device capabilities. There are fragmentations around versions, Play Store versions, or Play Services versions, etc., that could affect your devices. Um, and then there's understanding that, um, just moving from this iOS to the Android world, your your apps, if you just move them as is or port them directly, they may not behave the way you want it to, just because of the way that lifecycle works on Android. So you still need to understand and how actually it's not just the language, right? It's how does Android OS and the platform behaves, that you'll need to understand. The I know in our notes we had SSO, right? That's another key portion that we're heavily involved in. Um, there hasn't been a really good standard SSO for devices, for Android devices up until recently, where folks have been moving to, or Google's quietly pushing towards the use of Chrome custom tabs. Um, whereas on iOS, you just had WebKit. That's it. That's tied to Safari. Um, and then just a few OEM quirks that that you deal with, depending on which OEM you go to.
So understand those differences as you get into it. All right. So if I had to take the last 30 minutes and just compress it, I think the key takeaways I had that Richard, your starting statement on focus on the experience early on, think about those operational processes, what those are. Don't be tied into a one-for-one migration. Just like, don't be stuck in the box. I think that's a big one for me. I think getting the hardware that's right for you, so that running those POCs, testing different hardware platforms, identifying the one that fits your needs. There are a lot of OEMs on the Android side, so really, keeping your eyes open to what you like and don't like there. Running the projects and deployments like it is a project, so you're not just doing you ship and swap. It's a project that needs to run. So having POCs, pilots, and then Alan, from your standpoint, I think a lot of the things you talked about is there's much different, with the additional OEMs, different Android versions, you're going to get a lot more capabilities, but you're also going to have a lot more to go understand and try to learn. So making sure your teams understand those. And then, I think at the end of the day, like the big takeaway, we've done this multiple times with a lot of large companies. It is something that could be done, plan it appropriately, give yourself the 6 to 12 months to go do it, and then get it out the door. So thank you guys for joining me and hopping through this topic today. If you're in one of these migrations, I know Richard and Alan do hop on the phone a lot with a lot of people and give their experiences. So no judgment there. You guys have seen all the problems, so definitely feel free to reach out to us at info@BlueFletch or hit us up on the website. And then if you have any other questions outside of that, like the SSO pieces that Richard and Alan are talking about, definitely reach out. So thank you very much, and appreciate everybody listening along today. And Richard and Alan, thank you guys very much.
Thank you for tuning into the Frontline Mobility Edge. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe for more content every month. If you'd like to learn more about BlueFletch, check out the link in the description or visit us at bluefletch.com. See you next time.